Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where we uncover America's forgotten past and bring to life the stories history tried to bury. If you enjoy tales of hidden history, dark legacies, and the untold truths of old America, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story. This is the story of the Appalachia Clan of Death, a family history. You've never heard Dot in the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where fog clings low to the valleys, and the ridges rise like ancient walls. Stories have always lingered in whispers. The Appalachians are a place of music and hardship, of old ballads that tell of loss, and of blood feuds that lived longer than the men who started them. For generations, the mountains have been home to families who carried their pride there, secrets and their scars like heirlooms. It is here, in this rugged and unyielding land, that the story of one of the deadliest families ever to walk those hollows took shape. A story buried beneath silence, old court records, and the fearful glances of neighbors who dared not speak their names. They were known by some as nothing more than a clan, but those who lived close by called them something darker, something closer to a curse. This family did not leave behind songs or poetry. They left behind graves, some unmarked, some forgotten, some still hidden by brush and weeds in the corners of old fields where corn once grew tall. They lived in the backwoods where lawmen came slow, if they came at all, and where kinship often meant more than justice. Their story begins in the late 1800s, when Appalachia was changing. Railroads were cutting through the mountains, coal mines were digging deeper, and the outside world was pressing in on people who had lived much the same way for 100 years. But for this family, change did not bring hope. It brought anger, suspicion, and violence. The patriarch of the clan was a man who had grown up hard and mean, shaped by poverty and a lifetime of grudges. Folks said he had the kind of stare that could chill your bones, the kind of presence that filled a room with dread even when he said nothing. He worked the land when he wanted to, but more often he worked people. His temper was quick, his hand quicker, and when drink found him, which it often did, he became the sort of man others avoided. His children grew up watching this, breathing it in like the smoky air of their cabin's fire. They learned early that cruelty was a tool, not a shame. And when they were old enough to strike out on their own, they carried his lessons with them. First death that could be tied to the clan was spoken of only in hushed tones. A neighbor, a man who had lived just a ridge over, had argued with the patriarch about land boundaries. The Appalachian hills are filled with ridges and hollows where property lines were sometimes marked by little more than a tree or a stream. Arguments over them could drag on for years, but this one ended fast. The neighbor disappeared. His horse was found wandering near the creek, his tools lying abandoned in the dirt, but the man himself was gone. Folks whispered that the clan had done it. No body was ever found, but in those mountains, a body didn't need to be found for people to know what had happened. Fear traveled quicker than proof. The sheriff came, made a show of asking questions, but with no witnesses and no remains. There was nothing to pin on them. The family sat on their porch, silent, daring anyone to accuse them outright. No one did. The lesson was clear. The clan could do as they pleased. From then on, the family's name carried a weight. Livestock went missing. Moonshine stills that didn't belong to them were suddenly destroyed. Strangers who wandered too close to their holler vanished. Some came back beaten half to death, warning others never to set foot near the clan's land. Others never came back at all. And though everyone suspected, no one spoke openly. In those days, law in the mountains was not written on paper. It was written in fear and silence. But fear has a way of twisting even tighter when it takes root inside a family. The patriarch's sons grew into men who had learned to fight before they had learned to farm, and their anger was turned not just outward, but inward. Brothers turned on brothers. Arguments that started over hunting rights, or who would get to tend which patch of corn, ended in blood. Knives were pulled, guns drawn, and more than once, a family feud within the clan spilled out into the community. A boy of 15, kin to the clan, was said to have been beaten near to death by his own uncle for speaking out of turn. Another cousin disappeared entirely, swallowed up by the mountains or the clan's fury nobody knew for sure. The daughters of the family carried their own kind of power. In Appalachia, women often bore the burdens of silence, but in this clan, they learned that silence could be a weapon too. They covered for their brothers and fathers, told stories to mislead lawmen, and when necessary, delivered poison as quietly as they delivered food. Some said one of the daughters had married a man from a neighboring town, and that within 2 years he was found dead, his body laid out in bed as if asleep, but his lips stained black from what he'd swallowed. No charges were ever made. His death was listed as an illness, though everyone in town knew better. That daughter returned home to the clan not long after, carrying nothing with her but the shadow of what she had done. The clan's reach grew. They weren't just a family. They became a kind of dark empire within their holler. They controlled who could pass through, who could trade, and who could hunt in certain areas. Men from other families began to carry guns more openly, not just for hunting, but for protection. Mothers warned their children never to cross near the clan's land. Preachers mentioned them from the pulpit in veiled ways, speaking of sin and vengeance, but never naming names. Everyone knew. And yet, nothing was done. Then came the incident that cemented their reputation in blood. A traveling merchant, a man who had been known for years in those hills, made the mistake of stopping too long near the clan's homestead. He had been seen counting his money in the town nearby. A week later, his wagon was found overturned at the bottom of a ravine. His body lay broken beside it, but something was wrong. His injuries were not from the fall alone. His skull had been crushed, his ribs broken in ways that spoke of fists and boots rather than rocks. His money was gone. Word spread like wildfire, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though the law might act. But by the time the sheriff rode out to the holler, the clan was ready. They met him with rifles in hand, standing silent at the edge of their property. The sheriff turned back. Nothing more was said. From that moment on, the clan's name was spoken with dread, even beyond their own county. Travelers gave their holler a wide berth. Other families muttered darkly at gatherings about what should be done, but none dared act. The clan was no longer just feared, they were untouchable. They had tasted power, and blood was the price they were willing to pay to keep it. But what no one outside the clan knew was that their darkness was growing even within their own walls. The patriarch, now older and meaner than ever, demanded obedience. His sons had grown restless, his daughters bitter. The family feasted together at night with tense silences, each eyeing the other across the table, as though waiting for the next outburst, the next act of cruelty. And as the years rolled on, the violence that had once been turned outward began to turn inward with even greater ferocity. The clan had become a storm within the storm of the Appalachians. Their history was being written, not with ink, but with blood. And though the outside world would only catch glimpses of their deeds, those who lived nearby understood one terrible truth. The family's story was far from finished. The darkness that had begun with one man's temper and cruelty was spreading like wildfire through his kin, and before long it would consume them all and anyone who dared cross their path. As the years passed, the clan's holler grew darker, more isolated. Outsiders rarely dared enter, and even kin who married into other families often kept their distance. What had once been a place of timber and fields became a kingdom of suspicion. Their home Rough-hewn cabins with smoke rising through crooked chimneys stood like fortresses of fear. To pass by them on the trail was to feel eyes watching from behind curtains or tree lines, rifles hidden, but ready. The mountains had always been harsh, but here, under the shadow of the clan, they felt crueler. The patriarch's rule was absolute, but time was slowly turning his iron grip brittle. His body aged, his hair thinned, but his wrath never softened. He struck his children for slights real and imagined, berated his daughters for speaking too freely, and demanded loyalty from sons who were no longer boys, but grown men with tempers as fierce as his own. Each meal at their table was less like a family gathering and more like a truce waiting to break. The fire crackled, forks scraped against tin plates, and silence lay thick until an insult or drunken word sent the whole house into chaos. The first cracks in the clan's foundation came one winter when hunger gnawed at them worse than usual. Snow covered the hollows, food grew scarce, and tempers flared like sparks from the hearth. One of the younger sons, no more than 20, had been caught by his older brothers hiding away smoked meat in the loft of the barn. They dragged him out into the snow, shouting that he was a thief, that he had betrayed his kin. The patriarch watched from the porch, his eyes cold, his breath rising in pale clouds. Some say he gave a nod, others say he simply looked away, but either way, the brothers beat the young man until he never rose again. His body was buried beneath the frozen ground without a prayer. From that moment on, blood within the family became just as cheap as blood outside it. Brothers eyed each other with suspicion. Cousins whispered in corners, and daughters clutched their children close, praying the violence would not fall on them. Yet even as they tore each other apart, their cruelty toward outsiders only grew. Perhaps it was a way to bind themselves together, to remind themselves that their power still stretched beyond their own walls. It was around this time that a preacher from the lowlands wandered into the holler. He had heard stories, and he carried with him a kind of stubborn faith that no man, no matter how wicked, was beyond God's reach. He was warned not to go, but pride or conviction pushed him forward. Neighbors said he stood in front of the clan's cabin one Sunday afternoon, Bible in hand, his voice ringing against the hills as he called them to repent. The family listened in silence. The patriarch stepped forward, his weathered face unreadable. He let the preacher speak until his voice grew hoarse, until his knees trembled from the cold, and then, without a word, the patriarch motioned to his sons. The preacher was never seen again. His horse was found tied to a tree days later, starving and shivering in the snow. His Bible lay torn apart, pages scattered like dead leaves across the frozen ground. Word spread fast, but no lawman dared ride up to the clan's door. To the people of Appalachia, it was another grim reminder. Righteousness had no power here. The clan's infamy stretched further when the patriarch's eldest son began to take control of moonshine routes in the hills. Appalachia was built on whiskey as much as timber and coal, and for poor families, moonshining was both livelihood and survival. But for the clan, it was also a weapon. They destroyed stills belonging to rival families, shot at those who tried to set up business nearby, and forced others to pay tribute for the right to sell. Soon their liquor flowed through towns miles away, but always under their control. Every dollar filled their pockets. Every jug carried the taste of their violence. Yet prosperity, if it can be called that, only deepened their poison. With money came more guns, more drink, and more arrogance. The eldest son became as feared as his father, known for his sharp tongue and quicker trigger. He walked through towns with a swagger, daring anyone to challenge him. And when one man finally did, a farmer who had lost his still to the clan's raids, the town saw just how far their power reached. The two men argued in the middle of the street, fists clenched, voices raised. Before the sheriff could step in, the eldest son drew his pistol and shot the farmer where he stood. Broad daylight, witnesses everywhere, and still no charges. Sheriff's excuse was simple. No one had been willing to testify. Fear silenced every witness, sealed every mouth. The town buried the farmer, and the eldest son rode home laughing. For the clan, it was another victory carved in blood. Inside their holler, though, the air grew heavy with unease. The patriarchs. Grip weakened further, his health failing, and the eldest son demanded more control. He clashed openly with his brothers, each fight more violent than the last. The family that once stood united by fear of the outside world was now divided by their own greed and pride. Neighbors reported hearing gunshots echoing through the holler at night, followed by screams that carried down the valley dot and then came. The fire. One summer night, as storms rolled through the mountains, the clan's barn went up in flames. Whether it was lightning or revenge, no one ever knew for sure. But when the fire died down, 2 of the patriarch's grandsons were found dead inside. The family claimed it was an accident, that the boys had been trying to save livestock and had been trapped. But whispers told another story, that the fire had been set by one of their own, that the deaths had been no accident but punishment for betrayal. The truth was buried in ashes, but suspicion remained. Still, the clan endured. They endured because fear kept the law away, because neighbors valued survival over justice, and because the mountains themselves seemed to shield them. But endurance is not the same as peace. Each death, each act of cruelty, only fed the storm. Inside their bloodline dot by the time the patriarch finally drew his last breath, the holler he left behind was soaked in fear and resentment. His sons carried his coffin to the family plot with grim faces, but some said they saw a flicker of relief in their eyes. The old man was gone, but his shadow remained. And in his place, his eldest son rose to power, a man who had learned every dark lesson his father had taught, but who lacked even the small restraint that age and sickness had once forced upon the patriarch dot under this new leader. The clan did not just defend their land, they sought to expand it. Their raids grew bolder, their fights bloodier, their presence more unavoidable. The holler became less a home and more a stronghold, a nest of vipers coiled and ready to strike. Those who had once dared to hope the clan might weaken after the patriarch's death now saw the truth. The worst was yet to come. The story of the clan was not one of slow decay, but of wildfire, each generation burning hotter, brighter, and deadlier than the last. And as the eldest son took his father's chair at the head of the table, neighbors whispered in dread. If the patriarch had been a storm, his son was the lightning strike. The mountains had given birth to many legends, but none so dark as this family. And their story, already etched in blood, was about to grow even darker. The death of the patriarch was not the end of the clan's reign. It was the beginning of its fiercest chapter. With the eldest son now at the helm, the family entered a new age of violence. He was a man who had never known restraint, who wore cruelty like a second skin, and who believed fear was not just a weapon but a birthright. Under his rule, the clan no longer guarded their holler like a fortress. They pushed outward, extending their grip into nearby towns, trading posts, and mountain passes. For the first time, the fear that had once been confined to their valley spilled out into the wider Appalachian hills. Neighbors had long dreaded the sight of the family's horses riding down the trails, but now their presence carried the weight of conquest. They demanded tribute from other moonshiners, forced storekeepers to sell only their liquor, and made local farmers hand over a portion of their harvest. Refusal was met with punishment: livestock slaughtered in the fields, barns burned, wells poisoned. In the mountains, where survival depended on every scrap of food and every clean drop of water, such acts were more than cruelty. They were death sentences, But the clan's cruelty was not just measured in goods and power, it was measured in blood. One story that still lingers in the hollows tells of a wedding party that dared to celebrate too close to the clan's land. Families from neighboring ridges gathered in joy, with fiddles and banjos ringing out late into the night. The eldest son, drunk on whiskey and pride, rode down with several of his brothers. At first, the music faltered but continued, the guests trying to show respect, hoping the clan would pass by. But the eldest son demanded whiskey without offering coin, demanded the first dance with the bride, demanded to be treated not as a guest but as a lord. When the groom stepped forward to refuse him, the eldest son shot him dead where he stood, and chaos erupted. Screams carried through the valley, children hid beneath tables, and when the smoke cleared, 3 more men lay dead, their blood staining the dirt floor of the barn. The clan rode home with laughter, leaving behind grief so deep the community could scarcely put words to it. The law could no longer ignore such acts, but still their efforts seemed hollow. A deputy was sent to the holler to arrest the eldest son. He never returned. Weeks later, his body was found floating in the river, his badge missing, his hands bound. After that, few lawmen volunteered to ride into clan territory. The sheriff himself admitted, behind closed doors, that it would take an army to bring them down. But this was Appalachia. An army was never coming. The clan's reputation began to spread far beyond the mountains. Newspapers in nearby towns carried half-whispered accounts of their deeds. Words like terror and outlaw began to appear in print, though always couched in careful language. Even in black and white ink, the clan's shadow loomed larger than the truth. Stories blurred fact and rumor, but all painted the same picture: a family that killed without fear and lived beyond the reach of law. Yet within the clan itself, power was anything but stable. The eldest son ruled with an iron fist, but his brothers chafed under his dominance. Each wanted a greater share of the moonshine profits, a louder voice in decisions, a bigger place at the table. Their fights, once hidden within the cabin walls, spilled into the open. Shots rang out in broad daylight, not at strangers, but at kin. A cousin was gunned down at a still after an argument over stolen jugs. Another brother was found face down in the creek, his skull split open by the butt of a rifle. Some said it was outsiders who killed him. Others whispered it was his own blood. The truth was swallowed by the mountains, but the effect was the same. The clan grew more fractured, more unpredictable, and yet their cruelty toward outsiders never slowed. If anything, it grew worse. With every internal death, the surviving members seemed to lash out at the world around them, as if to remind themselves they still held power. A traveling doctor who passed through the holler to treat a sick child was beaten and robbed. A merchant's wagon was stopped on the road, its goods stolen, the merchant himself left tied to a tree before a farmer found him. Each act carved deeper fear into the hearts of those who lived nearby. Families packed their wagons and left the region altogether, abandoning homesteads rather than live under the shadow of the clan. But for every family that fled, others stayed, and their anger began to build. Old Appalachian pride runs deep, and while fear can silence a man, grief can give him courage. Quiet meetings were held in barns and back rooms. Farmers, preachers, and rival moonshiners began to talk of rising against the clan. They spoke of forming a posse, of storming the holler with rifles, of ending the reign of terror once and for all. These whispers grew louder after the wedding massacre, louder still after the deputy's death. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath, waiting for the clash that everyone knew was coming. The first strike came not from the law, but from another family. They were known in those parts as tough men, moonshiners themselves, and they had lost kin to the clan's violence. One autumn night, under cover of darkness, they set fire to one of the clan's hidden stills. The blaze lit up the mountainside, a beacon of defiance. The clan retaliated with a fury that shook the valley. For 3 nights, gunfire echoed through the ridges. Homes were shot into, barns burned, livestock slaughtered. By the time it ended, 3 men from the rival family lay dead, and the survivors had fled into the lowlands. The message was clear. Opposition meant annihilation. Yet even victory carried a cost. The eldest son's paranoia grew. He trusted no one, not even his own kin. He began to sleep with a shotgun across his lap, demanded constant loyalty, and punished even small slights with violence. His brothers, already restless, began to plot. Rumors spread that one of them had gone to the sheriff in secret, offering information in exchange for protection. Whether this was true or not, no one ever found out, because the brother in question was soon found dead in his bed, his throat cut ear to ear. The clan's holler had become a kingdom of ghosts. Graves outnumbered crops, hatred outpaced love, and suspicion rotted every bond. Still, the eldest son clung to power, convinced that fear would keep his world intact. But the mountains have a way of humbling even the most feared men. Time was moving, and with it came new forces even the clan could not control. The railroads were cutting deeper into the Appalachians. Coal companies were bringing in outside workers, men who did not know the clan's name and did not care about their power. Federal agents, sent to crack down on moonshining, began to hear of the family's crimes. And though fear still cloaked the holler, it was thinning. Change was coming, and for the clan, change meant danger. The eldest son, blind to the shifting winds, only grew bolder. He believed the mountains would always protect him, that fear would always silence men, that the law would never dare. But even as he sat at the head of his father's table, laughing with blood on his hands, the ground beneath him was shifting. His reign, like his father's, was not eternal. The storm he had built was about to turn against him. The clan had survived whispers, gunfire, and blood, but the next chapter of their story would be unlike anything they had faced before. The mountains themselves seemed to sense the calm before the breaking. And when the break came, it would not just shake their holler. It would shake the entire Appalachian hills. By the turn of the century, the holler that once sheltered the clan had become a place of dread to anyone who passed through the mountains. The sound of dogs barking in the night, the glint of lantern light through pine trees, the crack of rifles. Echoing off ridges, these were the signs that you had wandered too close to their land. For decades, fear had been enough to keep them safe. But time has a way of wearing down even the strongest walls, and in the end, it was not bullets or fire alone that undid the clan. It was their own blood, their own betrayals, and the slow, unstoppable march of change. The eldest son, now the leader, sat like a king in his father's chair. He drank more, laughed louder, killed quicker. He believed the family was untouchable, that no sheriff or soldier could cross the holler and leave. But arrogance is a dangerous companion in the mountains. He failed to see how the world beyond their valley was shifting. The coal companies, backed by powerful men far from Appalachia, began sending agents into the hills to secure land. These men were not mountain-born. They didn't bow to local legends or ghost stories. They came with money, contracts, and hired guns. And though they tried at first to avoid the clan, conflict was inevitable. It began with a land surveyor, a young man from the lowlands, who dared to mark off acreage near the clan's property. The family ambushed him in broad daylight. He was beaten bloody, his maps and instruments burned, his body dumped on the roadside as a warning. But this was not like killing a neighbor or a traveling preacher. This man worked for powerful men with ties beyond the mountains. Within weeks, Federal agents rode into town, their presence sending a shiver through the hollers. The clan laughed at first, mocking the outsiders who dared enter their world. But when the agents returned again and again, each time with more men, it became clear the balance of power was changing. The law, once paralyzed by fear, now had numbers and backing. Still, the holler was not easy to breach. Each attempt to capture members of the clan ended in bloodshed. Shots fired from hidden ridges picked off deputies before they ever reached the cabins. One raid ended with 3 federal men lying dead. In the creek, their uniforms stained with mountain mud. Newspapers in faraway cities picked up the story, calling the family the most dangerous outlaws east of the Mississippi. The clan reveled in the infamy. But infamy brought attention, and attention was the one thing they could never survive. For Long Dot, it was not just outsiders pressing in. It was the family itself unraveling. The endless cycle of suspicion had grown unbearable. Brothers accused. Brothers of stealing money, of whispering to lawmen, of plotting to take power. The eldest son ruled with fists and gunfire, but whispers carried in the dark of the cabin. Whispers of betrayal. Whispers of vengeance. One winter night, those whispers became action. As the eldest son drank himself into a stupor by the fire, one of his younger brothers crept behind him with a shotgun. The blast shattered the silence of the holler, and when the smoke cleared, the man who had led the clan through its bloodiest years lay slumped in his father's chair, his chest torn open. His killer did not stay to face retribution. He fled into the mountains, hunted by kin, and was never seen again. Some said the family caught him and buried him in a shallow grave. Others claimed he escaped into the lowlands and lived under another name. The truth was swallowed by the ridges, as so many truths had been. The murder of their leader did not break the clan's power immediately, but it poisoned what little unity remained. Each surviving brother tried to seize control, but none had the strength to command the whole family. Factions formed, alliances shifted, and the holler became a battleground not just against outsiders, but against itself. Cabin walls that once rang with laughter and fiddle music now echoed with curses and gunshots. It was said that even the children carried knives, their young faces hardened by the only life they had ever known. The outside world watched closely. Federal agents, rival moonshiners, even curious journalists, all saw the clan tearing itself apart. The law waited, knowing time and hunger would do what bullets had failed to finish. And they were right. The final collapse came in the form of betrayal. A daughter of the clan, weary of blood and desperate for a life beyond the mountains, walked into a sheriff's office in a nearby town. She carried with her knowledge of hidden trails, buried moonshine caches, and the locations of cabins where her brothers hid. For the first time, the law had a map into the heart of the holler. Within weeks, a large force descended on the valley. They came armed and ready, sweeping through with a fury the mountains had rarely seen. Gunfire thundered for days. Cabins burned, stills were destroyed, and the clan fought back with every ounce of their ferocity. But the outcome was certain. When the smoke cleared, many of the clan lay dead, their bodies sprawled in the ashes of their homestead. Others were dragged in chains to stand trial. Courtrooms miles from their mountains echoed with stories of murder, theft, and terror. Witnesses who had stayed silent for decades finally spoke, emboldened by the sight of the family shackled before them. Some clan members were sentenced to prison, others to the gallows. A few vanished into the wilderness, never to be seen again, living only in the whispers of old men around firesides. The holler, once feared as a kingdom of death, fell silent. Grass grew over the paths where riders once thundered, weeds choked the graves of nameless victims, and the cabins rotted into the earth. By the time the next generation came of age, the clan's land was little more than a ruinous scar in the mountains, remembered but avoided. Yet their story did not die. In the mountains, memory is long, and whispers linger. Old men spoke of the clan when the fire burned low, warning children never to wander too far. Ballads were sung in secret, there, verses heavy with blood and betrayal. And in the valleys beyond, their tale became a legend, a cautionary story of pride, violence, and the price of living by fear. The Appalachia Clan of Death left no monuments, no noble legacy, no songs of triumph. What they left was a trail of graves, broken families, and a holler steeped in sorrow. They were a storm born of poverty and rage, a family that turned their own blood into both weapon and curse. Their reign was long, their cruelty deep, but in the end, even they could not escape the truth that has haunted every outlaw who ever thought himself untouchable. Fear cannot last forever. Today, if you walk those ridges, you might find nothing more than fallen chimneys and moss-covered stones. But the silence there is heavy. The mountains remember, even when people forget. And if you listen closely, when the wind howls through the trees and the moon hangs low over the valley, you might hear the echo of gunshots, the cries of the lost, the laughter of men who thought themselves kings. The clan is gone, but there, shadow lingers. A family history you were never meant to hear, a story carved not into books, but into the very bones of Appalachia. The Appalachia Clan of Death, a name that even now, more than a century later, still sends a chill down the spine of those who dare to speak it aloud.